The studio lights burned with an almost theatrical intensity, throwing shadows that stretched across the polished desk like long fingers reaching for control. Sean Hannity leaned forward, shoulders squared, jaw set as if preparing for battle. His voice, honed by decades of primetime combat, slipped into the air with calculated precision. "Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett," he began, his tone dripping with both familiarity and accusation. "You've made a career out of sidestepping the hard truths. Tonight, I intend to hold you accountable." The camera split the screen. On one side, Hannity's smirk, half smile, half challenge, broadcast into millions of homes. On the other, Jasmine Crockett sat poised, her expression calm but electric, the kind of composure that suggested a storm barely contained. She wore a deep blue suit, its sharp edges a mirror of her resolve, her hands resting lightly on the table in front of her. The silence between them vibrated. An off-mic whisper from the production crew floated in. "This one's going to get ugly." Hannity wasted no time. A reel of clips rolled onto the monitors behind him, fragments of Crockett's speeches spliced together with headlines that flared in bold letters. "Flip-flop on crime," "Mixed messages on public safety," "Contradictions on voting rights." Each soundbite was clipped to wound, each headline sharpened to a blade. "Your record," Hannity pressed, voice lowering as if confiding in the audience, "shows a pattern. You've told your constituents one thing and then voted another. Which Jasmine Crockett are we supposed to believe?" The crowd in the studio shifted, murmurs blending with the faint rustle of paper and the hum of stage lights. Jasmine did not flinch. She inhaled slowly, her gaze fixed on Hannity as though measuring not the man, but the performance. When she spoke, her voice carried a steadiness that defied the tension pressing against her chest. "Let's not confuse political theater with truth," she said, her words precise, clipped, and deliberate. Gasps rippled across the audience. This was no rehearsed back and forth, no careful dance for ratings. Her tone was sharper than expected, her stance less defensive than defiant. The director cut to a close-up, her face illuminated by clean white light, eyes unwavering, the corners of her mouth set in resolve. Hannity, cast in more dramatic shadow, leaned further into his desk, his eyes narrowing as though daring her to continue. Crockett lifted one hand and placed it over the notes stacked neatly before her, a gesture not of nervousness but of control. Her fingers tapped once, softly but audibly, punctuating her point. "You built your career," she continued, her gaze never breaking from Hannity's, "on reducing complex issues into sound bites. But the people I represent, they don't live in sound bites, they live in reality. And reality is far less flattering to your narrative." Hannity's eyebrow arched. A faint smirk tugged at his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. The silence stretched. Viewers at home felt the current, the sense that what had begun as another Fox News segment was becoming something else entirely. Something raw, unscripted, volatile. The music underneath swelled. A low string section in the broadcast package, rising just enough to underscore the drama. Jasmine leaned back, her posture as controlled as her tone. For the first time, Hannity's smirk faltered, just slightly. The screen flickered, and for a fleeting moment, the confrontation froze, two figures locked in ideological combat. Then the chyron sharpened into focus. Sean Hannity versus Jasmine Crockett, live. The hook was set. The clash was inevitable, and the receipts, as promised, were coming. The studio's temperature seemed to shift as the first exchange settled. The audience adjusted in their seats, whispering low, like jurors deliberating before the trial had even begun. Hannity leaned back, a flash of confidence returning to his features. He tapped the edge of his notes, a rehearsed rhythm meant to steady himself and signal dominance. "You've made a name for yourself in Washington," he began, voice calm but edged with challenge. "Civil rights attorney turned congresswoman, selling reform to your voters. But let's talk about your record, because the numbers don't lie." Behind him, graphics splashed onto the screen, crime statistics in Dallas, headlines from local outlets, images of city streets captured under harsh fluorescent lights, red arrows pointed upward, designed to imply chaos, decline, failure. Hannity turned his hand upward, as if offering proof. "You called for reform," he pressed, his words deliberate. And yet your district continues to suffer. Murders, assaults, robberies. You said your policies would bring relief. What do you call this? Relief? The crowd murmured. Some nodded, some folded their arms as if skeptical. Jasmine's eyes narrowed, though her body remained composed. She adjusted the microphone, her voice steady but carrying an edge of steel. What I call this, she answered, is the reality of a system in transition. And if you're going to pull up statistics, then let's pull them all up, not just the ones that serve your narrative. She reached down and slid a folder across the table, its pages marked with tabs. Under the lights, the paper gleamed white, clinical, official. These are FBI uniform crime reports, she continued, her tone gathering momentum. Yes, violent crime has fluctuated, but look closely. In the past 2 years, aggravated assault has stabilized, robbery is down, property crime is trending down, but and you won't mention that because the truth doesn't fit neatly into your headline graphics. Hannity shifted, his smirk thinning. He reached for his pen, scribbling something in the margin of his notes, but the camera caught the faint twitch at the corner of his jaw. The audience leaned in now, silent. The confrontation was no longer abstract. It had become a battle of receipts, charts, raw data. Jasmine pressed on, her voice taking on the cadence of a courtroom closing argument. You sit here and pretend that reform is failure, but reform isn't a magic wand. It's a process. And while you run your clips of cherry-picked crime scenes, I sit across from mothers who have lost sons to cycles of poverty and incarceration. That's not a statistic. That's a life. And if you really care about public safety, then you care about addressing the roots of violence, not just sensationalizing the symptoms. A hush fell. Even Hannity, momentarily, allowed her words to breathe. But then he struck back, leaning forward, elbows on the desk. You can talk about root causes all you want. At the end of the day, the people in your district are scared. They don't want nuance. They want safety. And you're telling them to wait for results while they bury their loved ones. The words hung heavy. The crowd shifted again, some nodding in grim agreement. Jasmine inhaled deeply, her fingers tightening on the edge of her folder. For a heartbeat, her composure seemed fragile, like glass under strain. Then her voice rose again, softer now, more intimate. You think I don't know fear? She asked, her tone dropping into a register that silenced even Hannity. I've walked those streets at midnight. I've sat in living rooms where mothers held photographs of sons they'll never see again. I don't talk about this because it looks good on TV. I talk about it because I've lived it, and I carry those faces with me into every vote I cast. The room was still. Even the audience, who had come expecting fireworks, now seemed caught in the gravity of her words. She lifted a page from the folder, holding it. The hum of the studio deepened as if the walls themselves anticipated the collision to come. Hannity straightened in his chair, a hunter scenting fresh blood. His voice dropped into that low, almost conspiratorial tone that longtime viewers knew well, the tone that signaled he was about to unveil what he considered undeniable. Congresswoman, he began, you've stood on the House floor calling for stronger border security. You said we need federal action to protect communities like yours, but let's be honest here. The border is not secure. You know it, I know it, and every American watching knows it. So, why are you telling one story at home and another in Washington? The screen behind him lit up with a reel of grainy night vision clips. Men climbing fences, groups running across arid landscapes, headlines flashing. Border crisis worsens. Record encounters at southern border. The montage was quick, almost frantic, designed to imprint chaos. The audience reacted with scattered gasps and low murmurs. Hannity leaned back, his expression triumphant, as though the evidence were irrefutable, but Jasmine did not move. Her stillness was its own defiance. She reached into the folder at her side and withdrew a chart printed in stark black and white. She held it up for the camera, the paper crisp against her fingers. These, she said evenly, are DHS quarterly reports. The most recent, publicly available. Do you see what they show? Processing times for asylum applications improving. More resources deployed to Border Patrol. A reduction in backlog since the implementation of targeted funding. Her voice cut through the hum like a scalpel, precise and calm. She tapped the chart once, the sound amplified by the microphone. No one, least of all me, is saying the border is without challenges. But let's ground this in facts, not in fear-mongering clips pulled from a montage. The improvements are real, the numbers are here, the receipts, she paused, letting the words settle like a challenge across the room, are right in front of you. The audience shifted. Some clapped softly, though others remained skeptical, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. The tension was alive, breathing. Hannity pressed forward. So, you're admitting it's not secure. And isn't it also true that you supported language in House Bill 6 that offered blanket amnesty, yes or no? His words cracked like a whip. The phrase, blanket amnesty, echoed through the studio. Heavy, damning. Jasmine inhaled slowly. She lowered the chart and pulled another sheet from her folder. It was highlighted, annotated, legislative text. Her eyes locked on Hannity as she raised it. What you call blanket amnesty is a distortion, she replied, her tone firmer now, edges sharpened. The bill offered targeted relief to dreamers and streamlined legal immigration pathways. It was about creating order, not chaos, and if you actually read the committee report, which is right here, you'd see it includes enhanced funding for border technology and staffing. That's not amnesty. That's balance. She laid the paper flat, her hand pressing against the highlighted lines. Her posture radiated both exhaustion and defiance, the body language of someone who had fought this battle 100 times, but knew this moment demanded it again. The crowd rippled with reaction. Some nodded, murmuring agreement, others leaned back, unimpressed. The room was a divided jury, each side clinging to its own truth. Hannity's eyes flickered, quick and restless, like a boxer searching for a new angle. He leaned forward, stabbing his pen into the desk as if punctuating his next strike. Balance, or political doublespeak. The American people hear pathways and know exactly what that means. Open borders, lawlessness. You can dress it up however you want. Jasmine's gaze sharpened, her voice now heavy with restrained fire. Words matter, Sean. Lawlessness is what happens when we ignore comprehensive reform. When, the room seemed to vibrate with a quiet fury as Jasmine stepped further into the center of the courtroom. The microphone caught the subtle rhythm of her breath, steady but sharpened, the sound of someone who had measured the weight of every word before speaking it. Across from her, Sean Hannity leaned back in his chair, his arms folded as if the fold itself were armor. He had built his career on bluster, on owning the last word. But here, under oath and in the full gaze of the public, his silence betrayed something else, defensiveness cloaked in bravado. Jasmine's voice cut through the air, firm yet restrained. You've made a career out of telling America who to trust, who to fear, and who to dismiss. But today, Mr. Hannity, you don't get to decide the narrative. The truth will. The crowd stirred. Reporters scribbled notes furiously, cameras whirring as flashes of light illuminated Hannity's expression. He gave a half smirk, one designed for television, but here it felt misplaced, hollow. He spoke at last, his tone dripping with practiced sarcasm. Congresswoman Crockett, I didn't realize we were here for a lecture. Last I checked, this was a courtroom, not your personal stage. Jasmine tilted her head slightly, letting his words hang in the air before answering. If it feels like a stage, perhaps that's because you've spent decades turning America's democracy into one. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The judge rapped the gavel once, not to silence her, but to remind the room that order was fragile, precious, and easily shattered. Hannity leaned forward now, his smirk fading. You're trying to paint me as some villain, but all I've ever done is give voice to people who feel unheard. Is that a crime? Jasmine's gaze didn't waver. Giving voice is not a crime, but weaponizing that voice to distort truth, to sow division, to shield corruption. That's more than irresponsible. It's dangerous. Her words struck like blows, not with volume, but with precision. Hannity shifted uncomfortably, his hand tightening around the edge of the desk as though anchoring himself. The narration of the moment seemed to belong to history itself, as though the walls of the courtroom bore witness not just to a clash of individuals, but to a clash of ideals. On one side, the machinery of media power, sharpened and polished for ratings. On the other, the raw force of accountability, carried in Jasmine's measured cadence. "You think," Jasmine continued, her voice lowering into a blade-like softness, "that repeating a lie enough times makes it truth. But truth doesn't bend to repetition. It doesn't care about how loud you shout. Truth waits. And when it arrives, it's undeniable." The spectators leaned in, breathless. A woman in the front row clutched her notebook so tightly the paper bent beneath her fingers. A young law student, seated near the back, whispered, "She's dismantling him," though the words were barely audible over the charged silence. Hannity tried to recover, letting his tone flare with indignation. "So now you're the arbiter of truth. Who gave you that right?" Jasmine didn't flinch. "The people who elected me. The Constitution I swore to uphold, and the conscience that refuses to be bought or bullied." There was no applause, no eruption, just silence, deep and heavy. A silence that confirmed her words had landed where they were meant to, in the conscience of every listener. The judge leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowed as if weighing the temperature of the room. Hannity exhaled through his nose, long and sharp, the mask of composure slipping for just a heartbeat. The chapter ended not with a final word, but with Jasmine's steady gaze holding his, a silent declaration that the reckoning had only just begun. The chamber felt heavier now, as though the very air inside had been thickened with anticipation. The flicker of camera lenses illuminated the walls like silent lightning strikes, each flash preserving a moment of tension that seemed destined for history. Sean Hannity leaned back in his chair, his expression torn between arrogance and unease. He had survived countless controversies before. What made this any different? His eyes darted toward Jasmine Crockett, who stood at the center of the storm, her presence impossible to ignore. The silence was broken by a low, nervous laugh from Hannity. He shook his head and muttered, "This is nothing but political theater. I've been through worse, and I'll go through this too." But his words rang hollow, like an actor repeating lines no longer convincing even to himself. Jasmine didn't flinch. She studied him with a steady gaze, her voice sharp enough to slice through the haze of denial. "You call this theater?" she asked, her tone laced with steel. "The receipts in my hand aren't props, Mr. Hannity. They're evidence. Evidence of your role in manipulating the truth, bending facts until the American people couldn't tell day from night." A ripple spread through the chamber. Some leaned forward, straining to hear every word. Others exchanged uneasy glances, knowing full well the weight of what was being implied. Hannity tried to smirk, but it faltered under the intensity of her words. He pressed his palms together as if in prayer, though his eyes betrayed the calculation of a man searching for escape routes. "You think shouting accusations makes them real?" he fired back, forcing a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "You think the people will believe you just because you talk louder than everyone else?" Jasmine stepped closer, her voice steady, her conviction unshakable. "The people don't need me to talk louder, Sean. They need me to talk clearer, and that's exactly what I'm doing. For too long you've cloaked your commentary as truth, your bias as journalism, and your manipulation as patriotism. That ends here, under these lights, with these eyes watching." Gasps fluttered through the room. The camera zoomed tighter, catching the beads of sweat forming along Hannity's brow. He tried to laugh again, but the sound cracked like glass under pressure. "You're just trying to build your name off mine," he sneered, his tone turning bitter. "You wouldn't even be here if I hadn't paved the way. Remember that. Without people like me, you'd still be just another politician fighting for airtime." The words carried venom, but Jasmine refused to yield. She tilted her head slightly, almost pitying him. "You're right about one thing," she said softly. "You did pave the way. But the road you paved is filled with deception, with half-truths dressed as patriotism. And the difference between us, Mr. Hannity, is that I'm not here to be remembered for noise. I'm here to be remembered for truth." The chamber erupted, not in applause, not in outrage, but in a raw, palpable energy that surged from every corner. The tension had reached its boiling point, and the audience could sense that Hannity's defenses were crumbling piece by piece. He leaned forward, his face shadowed by the lights, his voice trembling though he fought to hide it. "You don't know what you're up against, Crockett. You think truth alone will protect you. This system, this country. It doesn't work the way you pretend it does." Jasmine's eyes blazed with defiance. "I don't pretend," she answered, her tone rising with righteous fire. "I expose. And if the system is as broken as you claim, then it's because voices like yours poisoned it for profit." The words landed like thunder. The chamber seemed to shake beneath them. Hannity, for the first time, had no immediate reply. His silence was louder than any denial he could have offered, and in that silence, Jasmine held her ground, not just as a politician, but as a woman who understood the heart. The courtroom had grown tense, air thick with the weight of accusation and counter-accusation. The judge leaned back slightly, watching with weary eyes as the clash of egos unfolded before him. The gallery murmured in hushed tones, spectators leaning forward as if unwilling to miss even a single breath. Sean Hannity straightened his papers. Though his hands betrayed a faint tremor, he had weathered countless debates on television, but this room was not a studio with bright lights and commercial breaks. Here, the stakes were higher, the silence heavier, and the witnesses real. Jasmine Crockett did not sit quietly in her chair. She leaned forward, resting her forearms on the table, her sharp gaze cutting into Hannity with the precision of a blade. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, deliberate, the kind of tone that forced the room to still. "You think this is about politics," she said, her words slicing through the space between them. "You think this is another debate stage, another moment to twist narratives until the truth suffocates beneath them. But this," she tapped her hand against the polished wood, "isn't Fox News. This is the record. And once it's written here, Sean, it cannot be spun." Hannity forced a tight smile. "Congresswoman, with all due respect, you're mistaking journalism for spin. My job is to inform the American people." The gallery hissed, laughter and disbelief mingling in a single wave. Someone muttered under their breath, "Inform them. More like mislead them." The judge's gavel cracked once, silencing the ripple, but Jasmine used that very moment to rise from her chair. Her presence commanded the room, not because of theatrics, but because conviction dripped from every movement. She stepped closer to the stand. "Inform them. Then why, on that very night, did you knowingly air a segment that concealed documents proving your own guess? It was lying? Why did you shield him, protect him, when the truth was sitting in your inbox the entire time?" Hannity opened his mouth, but the words stumbled. His fingers twisted at the papers, searching for some anchor. He tried to recompose himself, to shift the narrative. "That's not how news works. We have deadlines, editorial processes." Jasmine cut him off sharply. "Deadlines don't erase facts. Processes don't bury truth unless someone orders them to. So, let's be clear. Was it you, or your network, who made that call?" The silence that followed stretched long enough to press on everyone's chest. Hannity's throat bobbed as he swallowed, lips parting without sound. For the first time, he looked less like the confident host and more like a man cornered by his own reflection. The gallery's energy shifted, almost electric. People sat on the edge of their seats, waiting for the unraveling. Finally, Hannity tried to redirect. His voice was quieter, but he aimed for defiance. "Congresswoman, perhaps your time would be better spent addressing the failures of your own party rather than trying to dismantle mine on live record." Jasmine didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned closer, her eyes narrowing. "I'm not dismantling your party. I'm dismantling lies. And if those lies wear your face, Sean, then that's not my burden. That's yours." The courtroom erupted. The gavel slammed again, demanding order, but the roar of reaction couldn't be muted so easily. In the shadows at the back of the room, reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras clicked like a storm, and the entire proceeding was being etched not just into legal history, but into the conscience of a nation watching. The courtroom, though already alive with tension, seemed to constrict further as Jasmine leaned forward, her voice deliberate, each word sharpened by the weight of truth. The room stilled, as though even the fluorescent lights hummed softer, waiting for her to speak again. "You wanted the receipts?" she asked, her hand brushing against the thick binder on the table. Her voice was low, steady, yet carrying an undeniable electricity. Here they are. A murmur rose instantly in the gallery. Sean Hannity's smirk faltered just slightly, but enough to reveal the crack in his armor. He shifted in his seat, the confidence he had paraded earlier beginning to erode under the piercing rhythm of Jasmine's resolve. The judge's gavel tapped once, not to silence her, but to signal the courtroom to listen. Jasmine stood, drawing every eye to her like gravity itself had shifted. She placed the binder on the podium, opening it slowly, deliberately, as though each page were a loaded weapon. The first document glimmered under the lights, a printed transcript. Jasmine lifted it, her eyes never leaving Hannity's. "This," she said, her tone calm but cutting, "is from your broadcast last year. Your words, not hearsay, not speculation, yours." She began to read, the cadence of her voice carrying the venom of the original intent, but reframed with devastating precision. Hannity shifted again, tugging lightly at his cufflinks, a nervous gesture unnoticed by most, but not by Jasmine, nor the dozens of cameras capturing every microsecond. As her words echoed through the chamber, the audience leaned in. The courtroom was no longer simply a venue for justice. It had become a theater, and Jasmine was directing the spotlight with surgical mastery. Hannity tried to interrupt. "That was taken out of context." But Jasmine cut him down with a sharp glance. "Context is exactly what I'm restoring. Mr. Hannity, the truth you stripped away when you spoke to millions of people." Her words lingered like smoke, impossible to disperse. The crowd gasped, not in chaos, but in quiet acknowledgement of the shift. The once assured figure at the defense table was shrinking, his usual bravado collapsing under the weight of his own words. Jasmine turned another page, then another, each one a revelation. Emails, notes, internal memos. Every sheet she revealed was a nail in the coffin Hannity had built for himself, and she hammered them down with unshakable precision. Her voice softened, but the softness was more dangerous than her sharpness. "You told America one thing, while these documents show you knew the opposite, and yet you kept pushing the same narrative. Why?" The silence in the room was suffocating. Hannity's jaw tightened, his throat bobbing as he swallowed the tension. But Jasmine didn't give him time to respond. She pressed forward, relentless, each word carving deeper into his carefully manufactured persona. The gallery erupted again, half in outrage, half in awe. The judge's gavel slammed, but even the gavel's echo could not smother the electricity coursing through the room. Jasmine let the noise swell, let it underline her point, then struck again. "You see, this isn't about mistakes," she said, her voice rising with the conviction of a storm. "This is about betrayal, betrayal of trust, betrayal of truth, and the people deserve to know." In that moment, Jasmine wasn't just a congresswoman, she wasn't just a lawyer standing in a courtroom, she was a force of reckoning, pulling the facade apart thread by thread until the man who had once projected dominance on television now looked cornered, his empire of rhetoric teetering on collapse. The gallery leaned forward, breaths caught. Hannity's silence was louder than any rebuttal, and Jasmine, sensing the shift in momentum, closed the binder with a decisive slam that reverberated through the chamber. "That," she said, her eyes never leaving his, "is what receipts look like." The audience erupted into applause before the gavel could strike again. Even the judge, though maintaining composure, couldn't completely mask the flicker of something, approval perhaps, hidden in his gaze. The tide had turned, and everyone knew it. The air in the chamber had grown dense, as though every breath carried the weight of history. The wood-paneled walls seemed to lean closer, catching every word, every hesitation. The judge's gavel had not struck, yet silence ruled. A silence born not of calm, but of anticipation. Jasmine Crockett adjusted her notes, but her eyes never left Sean Hannity. She knew the documents in front of her were weapons sharper than steel, but it was her presence, her refusal to bow, that made the moment electric. The audience sensed it, leaning forward, hungry for the collision they knew was about to unfold. Hannity crossed his arms, his voice heavy with disdain. "So this is what it comes down to? A pile of so-called evidence? Conspiracies dressed up in legal language?" He smirked, shaking his head. "I've faced worse. This doesn't scare me." Jasmine's lips curled into something between a smile and a challenge. It should. She leaned forward, her voice cutting clean through the stagnant air. Because this isn't conspiracy. This is proof, and you know it. A murmur rippled through the spectators, cameras flashing like restless lightning. Hannity raised his chin, feigning calm. Proof that what? That I exercised my right to speak? That I gave voice to millions of Americans who feel ignored? His words were sharp, but his hands betrayed him, tapping against the table, restless, betraying the storm within. Jasmine didn't blink. Proof that your voice wasn't just opinion. It was manipulation. It wasn't the echo of the people. It was the shaping of their fears, their anger, into a weapon, and you profited from it. Her words hung like smoke, clinging to the chamber. Hannity's jaw clenched. He tried to laugh, but it came out brittle. You think you can paint me as a villain? I'm a journalist. I ask questions. I give perspective. You can't punish someone for talking. Jasmine's voice dropped lower, deliberate, like a knife being unsheathed. Then explain this. She slid a folder across the table, the papers inside sliding free under the heat of the lights. Bank statements, emails, memos that bore his name. The crowd gasped. Hannity's eyes darted across the documents. His face hardened, though the flicker of panic was undeniable. You think this proves anything? Context matters. Without context, this is nothing but paper. Jasmine leaned back, folding her hands with unshakable calm. Context? She let the word linger. The context is betrayal. The context is manipulation. The context is your voice, broadcast into millions of homes, knowing it was built on falsehoods, knowing you were feeding lies for profit. And now, the truth has context too. Her voice rose slightly, carried by the charge of the moment. The truth is standing in this chamber. The audience erupted, half with applause, half with gasps and jeers. The judge banged the gavel, struggling to maintain order. Hannity's composure cracked, his face flushed with the weight of exposure. He pointed a trembling finger toward Jasmine. You're twisting this. You're making me into something I'm not. Jasmine leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. I'm not making you into anything. You made yourself into this. I'm just showing the mirror. For the first time, Hannity looked away, not at her, not at the crowd, but down at the polished table as though searching for an escape carved in the grain of the wood. His silence was louder than any words he could have spoken. The judge, weary but firm, finally intervened. Order in the court. This proceeding will not devolve into theatrics. But it was too late. The theatrics had already taken hold. Every spectator in that chamber, every camera broadcasting live knew they were watching more than an argument. They were watching a reckoning. Jasmine gathered her notes, her voice steady, unwavering. This isn't about silencing you, Mr. Hannity. This is about accountability. Words are not free when they chain people to lies. Influence is not harmless when it poisons the foundation of democracy. She paused, allowing the silence to stretch, the weight of her words pressing into the very walls. Then she looked him dead in the eye. And you can't run from that. Hannity opened his mouth to reply, but no words came. Only silence, thick and damning, lingered where defiance once roared. The chapter closed not with a gavel, but with the audience's unshakable realization. The tide had turned. The courtroom that had erupted with whispers and murmurs during the break now returned to silence as Judge Reynolds struck his gavel with measured force. The echo rang like a warning shot, reminding everyone that order was not optional. Tension hung thick in the air, so palpable it felt as though one could slice through it with a knife. Jasmine Crockett sat forward, hands folded atop the polished oak table, her eyes burning with intent. Her voice had not yet been spoken, but her presence alone pulled the attention of everyone in the chamber. Across from her, Sean Hannity leaned back in his chair, trying to appear unbothered, though the subtle twitch of his jaw betrayed unease. The judge's eyes scanned the room. We will now resume. Representative Crockett, you have the floor. Jasmine rose slowly, every movement deliberate. She carried herself not with arrogance but with conviction, the kind that made spectators lean forward unconsciously, drawn into her gravity. She glanced briefly at the rows of cameras perched on the iron tripods, each a silent sentinel transmitting this drama to a waiting nation. Your Honor, she began, her voice measured but edged with steel, we have reached a turning point. For hours, We've endured claims, denials, and verbal gymnastics. But the time has come to confront reality, not the illusion carefully spun for years by powerful voices. She turned sharply toward Hannity, her words like arrows seeking their mark. Mr. Hannity has insisted on framing himself as a truth-teller, a guide for the American people. Yet the evidence shows he was fully aware of fabrications being spread, fabrications that endangered not just reputations, but democracy itself. Hannity scoffed audibly, leaning forward. That's a gross misrepresentation, and you know it. I never… But Jasmine cut him off, her voice rising with precision. You never corrected the lies you knew were false. You profited from them, fueled divisions with them, and then washed your hands as if the fire you stoked wasn't consuming the nation. The gallery reacted. Soft gasps, a whispered, "My God," and the clicking of reporters' keyboards capturing every word. Judge Reynolds lifted his hand, urging the room to quiet. Jasmine walked closer to the jury box, her heels clicking against the marble floor, every step deliberate. She gestured to a stack of documents on the evidence table. These aren't my words, Mr. Hannity. These are your own emails, your own transcripts, your own voice. You called certain claims crazy, yet turned around and broadcasted them to millions as if they were gospel truth. Hannity's eyes narrowed, his voice sharp now. You're twisting context. I gave my audience what they wanted. Perspectives, debates, opinions. That's the role of a broadcaster. Her laugh was short, bitter, cutting through the silence like glass shattering. The role of a broadcaster, or the role of a propagandist, ways, willing to sell out the truth for ratings. The crowd stirred again, but this time there was something else, an undercurrent of anger, a collective recognition of the stakes. Jasmine seized it, her tone lowering into a kind of solemn intensity. You weren't speaking to a classroom of students, Sean. You weren't having a casual conversation in a bar. You were addressing millions of citizens desperate for clarity, for leadership. And instead of giving them truth, you handed them poison disguised as medicine. Hannity tried to retort, his voice cracking under pressure. That's easy for you to say. You thrive off tearing others down. You don't know what it's like to be the target, to carry that burden night after night. For the first time, Jasmine softened her tone, almost pitying. You're right about one thing, you carried a burden, but it wasn't the burden of truth, it was the burden of deceit, one you chose willingly, one you profited from, one that now you cannot escape. The judge shifted in his seat, glancing between the two, aware that this was more than cross-examination. It was a battle of narratives, one that history itself might remember. Jasmine took a breath, letting the silence stretch just long enough for tension to throb like a pulse in the chamber. Then she delivered the blow. The question isn't whether Sean Hannity can spin his way out of accountability. The question is whether this court, whether this nation, will allow the lies of the powerful to outweigh the cries of the people. Justice doesn't bend for ratings. Justice demands truth. Her words fell heavy, reverberating in the silence that followed. No one moved. Even the camera operators seemed frozen, lenses locked on her, as if afraid to miss the exact second the scales of this confrontation tipped. Hannity shifted in his chair, attempting a defiant smirk, but his hands betrayed him. They clenched and unclenched nervously on the table, betraying the unease gnawing at his confidence. Jasmine lowered herself back into her seat with slow precision, her face calm, yet unyielding. She had made her stand, and in the stillness that followed, it was clear the courtroom had felt the weight of it. Judge Reynolds cleared his throat. Mr. Hannity, you will have the opportunity to respond, but be advised, this proceeding is not a theater. It is a court of law, and here, only truth holds sway. For a moment, Hannity's lips parted as if to speak. Then, hesitating, he leaned back again. The smirk was gone, replaced with something rarer, something that rippled across the room like a signal. Doubt, and the people watching, inside the courtroom and across the nation, sensed it. The chamber had grown so tense, it seemed as though the very air itself was holding its breath. The reporters who had once scribbled with noisy haste were now silent, pens frozen above notepads, cameras focused without a single click, waiting for the next clash. Everyone could feel it. This was not just another argument. Not just another exchange between pundit and politician. This was a duel in front of the nation, and every word carried the weight of judgment. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, her voice low but sharp enough to slice through the fog of tension. "You've made your career selling outrage, Sean, but outrage without truth is just noise." Hannity smirked, though a bead of sweat betrayed him as it slid down his temple. He fired back with practiced bravado. "And you've made your career off of theatrics, Congresswoman. Don't lecture me about truth when your party twists it every day." The room stirred. Some leaned toward Hannity's words, but more turned back to Jasmine, as though instinctively knowing that she was about to unleash something deeper, something that couldn't be brushed off with sound bites. Jasmine inhaled slowly, her hands resting flat against the table. "You talk about twisting truth? Let's talk about receipts." She reached for the folder at her side and slid a document across the table with deliberate calm. "Right here is evidence of your network's coordination with political operatives. Talking points designed not to inform the public, but to inflame them. You didn't just echo lies, Sean. You packaged them, sold them, and profited while communities burned with division." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Reporters leaned in, eyes darting from the folder to Hannity's face. He scoffed, but the unease in his eyes betrayed the mask. "You think you're the first to wave around paperwork? Congress is full of it. Half-truths, out-of-context memos, fabricated nonsense." Jasmine's reply cut sharper than steel. "This isn't fabricated. These are your emails, Sean, your own words, your own strategy. You weren't just covering politics, you were orchestrating it." The chamber erupted in murmurs. The judge raised a hand, signaling for silence, but the energy was uncontrollable, spilling like a dam breaking. Hannity's chest rose and fell heavier now, his words faltering for the first time. "So what? So a journalist?" He corrected himself, bitterly. "A commentator has conversations? That's not illegal. That's not unusual." Jasmine didn't miss a beat. "No, Sean, it's not illegal, but it is immoral. It's corrosive, and it's exactly why people don't trust the institutions we're supposed to hold sacred. You pretended to be a voice of the people, when in reality you were just another megaphone for power." She stood then, not just speaking to Hannity anymore, but to the chamber itself, to the cameras that carried her words into millions of homes. "This isn't about me, and it isn't about you. It's about the truth that's been buried under years of shouting, fear-mongering, and manipulation. People are tired of being lied to, tired of being divided, tired of being told to fear their neighbor instead of hold accountable those who actually abuse power." The audience erupted, not in chaos this time, but in thunderous applause. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, pens racing now as though history was unfolding before them, and they couldn't afford to miss a single detail. Hannity tried to push back, raising his voice above the roar. "You think you're some kind of savior? You think waving papers and giving speeches changes the world? It doesn't. It's theater and you're an actress." Jasmine's response was softer, but it struck harder than any shout. She looked directly at him, her gaze steady and unwavering. "Maybe it is theater, Sean. But if it takes standing here and shining a light on the stage so people can finally see the script you've been hiding, then I'll play that role gladly." The words lingered like a final note in a symphony. Hannity's jaw clenched, his hands gripping the table so tightly the veins in his knuckles bulged. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the image of a man cornered not by force, but by truth itself. The judge finally banged the gavel, restoring a semblance of order. Yet even the gavel's echo couldn't drown the pulse of the moment. Everyone knew something irreversible had just happened. Jasmine gathered her papers with deliberate calm, her expression resolute. She had not only defended herself, she had turned the courtroom into a stage of revelation, forcing the nation to confront the rot at its core. And as Hannity sat back, swallowing the weight of the silence around him, one thing became painfully clear. The narrative he once controlled had slipped from his grasp, now rewritten by the very woman he had tried to dismiss. The chamber, still buzzing with energy, seemed to lean toward Jasmine as though the center of gravity itself had shifted. The fight wasn't over, but the balance had changed. The courtroom had reached a strange calm after the explosive back and forth of the morning. The crowd, exhausted but unwilling to leave, sat in their benches as though chained by invisible iron. Every cough, every shuffled footstep felt amplified in the heavy silence. Outside, television vans idled in long rows, their satellite dishes aimed skyward, transmitting the unfolding storm to millions of waiting screens. Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly upright, her hands resting lightly on the desk before her, as if she were conserving her energy for the strike she knew would come. Her eyes were fixed on the witness stand, where Sean Hannity, still flushed from his earlier testimony, fidgeted under the harsh fluorescent lights. The cameras caught every twitch of his fingers, every bead of sweat on his brow. The judge cleared his throat. "Representative Crockett, you may continue your questioning." Jasmine rose slowly, the scrape of her chair echoing in the hushed chamber. She didn't storm forward this time. Instead, she moved with deliberate restraint, each step purposeful, like a hunter circling its prey. When she reached the center of the floor, she clasped her hands behind her back and tilted her head slightly, studying Hannity as if he were a specimen under glass. "Mr. Hannity," she began, her voice quiet but carrying, "you've made a career out of controlling narratives, haven't you?" Hannity blinked rapidly. I've made a career out of telling the truth. My audience trusts me." A faint smile tugged at Jasmine's lips. "The truth?" Interesting choice of words. "Because what I see is not truth, but convenience. What I see is a man who bends facts to serve his friends in power." Hannity leaned forward in his seat, his hands gripping the edge of the witness box. "That's a baseless accusation, and you know it. You've built your entire brand on attacking conservatives, Ray. Representative Crockett, you're trying to score points at my expense." Jasmine stepped closer, her voice sharpening. "This isn't about scoring points. This is about accountability. You stood on your platform and told millions of Americans that my work, my investigations were lies. You smeared me as a blogger, as though truth depends on where it is spoken, rather than what it reveals." The audience murmured, and the judge rapped his gavel lightly for silence. Hannity's jaw tightened, his gaze darting between Jasmine and the rows of cameras at the back. "Do you deny saying it?" Jasmine pressed, her eyes narrowing. Hannity's lips curled into a half-smile, the kind of smirk that had carried him through countless television debates. "I don't recall every word I've said on air, but I stand by my criticism. You're not a journalist. You're a partisan hack dressed up as a crusader." The words lingered in the air, sharp as blades. A few gasps echoed through the gallery. Jasmine, however, did not flinch. She allowed the insult to hang there, unchallenged, for a long, heavy moment. Then she leaned in just slightly, her voice soft but loaded with power. "And yet, here you are, under oath, answering to me." The silence that followed was deafening. Hannity's smirk faltered, the weight of her words pressing down like a stone. The cameras captured the exact second his bravado cracked, his face betraying a flicker of uncertainty. Jasmine turned away from him then, addressing the court itself. "This is the pattern, ladies and gentlemen. Loud voices, confident lies, endless repetition. It works until the truth drags them into the light. And then all that swagger dissolves into excuses." The judge leaned back in his chair, watching her with cautious admiration. The jury members exchanged glances, some nodding faintly as if they too felt the shift. Hannity slammed his palm against the witness box. "You can't put me on trial for speaking my mind. This is America." Jasmine spun back to face him, her voice now rising like a storm. "No, Mr. Hannity, this is America, and America deserves more than deception dressed as commentary. America deserves leaders, journalists, citizens who face the truth, even when it cuts deep, especially when it cuts deep." For a moment, it seemed as though the entire courtroom was holding its breath. The tension swirled like electricity in the air, thick and palpable. Hannity opened his mouth to fire back, but no words came. His face burned crimson, his fists clenched white around the wood of the stand. Jasmine straightened her shoulders, her final words precise and cutting. "You called me a blogger, but history won't remember what you called me. It will remember what I proved here, today." The crowd erupted, not in cheers, but in a low, rumbling wave of approval that felt unstoppable. Even those who had doubted her now leaned forward, captivated, as though witnessing something irreversible. The judge banged his gavel hard. "Order! Order in the court!" But the order was already gone. The room had shifted, and everyone knew it. Jasmine had not just defended herself, she had claimed the narrative entirely, wrenching it from Hannity's grasp with a precision that left him exposed and trembling. As the murmurs swelled, Jasmine returned to her seat, calm as ever, her gaze fixed ahead. The storm had not ended, but in that moment she had seized control of its winds. The courtroom had grown used to tension, but as the gavel struck again, a new kind of silence gripped the chamber. It was the kind of silence that doesn't calm, but coils, waiting for an explosion. Cameras swiveled, their red lights blinking like watchful eyes. Everyone knew this chapter of the trial would not be a procedural exchange. It would be a collision. Jasmine Crockett sat forward in her chair, fingers clasped lightly on the table before her. Her eyes burned with quiet fire, but she held herself still, controlled, as though channeling her fury into poise. Across from her, Sean Hannity leaned back, arms crossed, lips curled with the kind of smirk that suggested he believed the room was his stage, the nation his audience. "Congresswoman," Hannity began, his voice oozing the confidence of a man used to commanding airtime. "You've built a career accusing others, pointing fingers. But here—" He spread his arms toward the courtroom. "You stand like anyone else. Suspect, questionable, vulnerable." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Some gasped, others whispered eagerly, sensing the bait Hannity had thrown into the water. His words weren't about law, but theater. He was appealing to the court of public opinion, not the judge's gavel. Jasmine didn't flinch. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying him, her silence pressing back harder than any quick rebuttal could. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was low, deliberate, every syllable wrapped in iron. "You think vulnerability is weakness. That's because you've never stood for anything that could break you. Vulnerability is what happens when you risk everything for truth." Her words carried, echoing through the chamber. Hannity leaned forward now, the smirk faltering. "Truth?" He laughed, though the sound was sharp, brittle. "Your truth is a partisan fairy tale. Your so-called evidence, manufactured outrage. Tell me, Congresswoman, how many times have you twisted the facts to fit your crusade?" A wave of murmurs spread again. The judge raised a hand for silence, but the tension only thickened. Jasmine inhaled slowly, gathering the weight of the moment. She turned her gaze from Hannity to the gallery, locking eyes with ordinary citizens seated behind the rail, teachers, veterans, parents. Her voice lifted, steady and resonant. "When they say I twist the facts," she said, "what they mean is that I don't let lies breathe. What they call a crusade is nothing more than refusing to look away when corruption hides in plain sight. Vulnerability isn't my liability, it's my proof. Because I've had to stand here again and again, knowing men like him will try to smear me, and still, I stand." Applause erupted from a section of the gallery before the judge's gavel slammed down. "Order!" But the applause had already planted its seed. Even the cameras caught the faces of jurors shifting, softening. Hannity noticed, his jaw tightening, the smirk now fully erased. "You grandstand," Hannity spat, but the force behind his words lacked conviction now. "You play the victim to cover your failures." Jasmine's hand came down on the table with a quiet, measured thud, her composure unbroken. "No," she said, "I play the survivor because you've built an empire on silencing victims. You profit from distortion, you twist pain into ratings, and you call that truth." The words struck like a gavel of their own. The silence that followed wasn't waiting for an explosion. This time it was the stunned silence of realization. Hannity opened his mouth to respond, but for the first time he seemed to falter. His eyes darted, searching for footing. The cameras saw it, the audience saw it, and Jasmine, sensing the turn, leaned closer, her voice sharp enough to cut the air. "You asked how many times I've twisted the facts?" Her eyes locked onto his, unblinking. "None. But how many times have you lied to millions and called it journalism? How many times have you chosen power over integrity? How many times have you gambled with the truth because you thought no one would hold you accountable? Her words came faster now, a rising crescendo, not of anger, but of conviction. The audience leaned forward, the entire courtroom suspended. In her rhythm, "This isn't about me, Mr. Hannity. It's about every person in this country who's tired of being told lies are truths, that corruption is patriotism, that manipulation is freedom. It's about the people watching right now, wondering if anyone in this chamber has the courage to call a lie a lie. And I do." Her final words hit like a hammer on stone, reverberating, undeniable. The judge's gavel struck again, but even his command for order felt secondary to the electricity Jasmine had ignited. The gallery was no longer whispering. They were watching with eyes wide, breaths held, aware they had just witnessed a turning point. Hannity sank back into his chair, the weight of her words settling over him. He adjusted his tie, his posture defensive now, and for the first time, he looked less like the seasoned broadcaster in control and more like a man exposed, unprepared for the force that had just met him. Jasmine didn't smile, didn't gloat. She sat back slowly, her hands returning to rest on the table, her face composed but her eyes still burning. The moment had shifted, and everyone in the courtroom felt it. The battle was far from over, but in this round, Jasmine had struck first blood. The courtroom was already heavy with tension, but as Jasmine Crockett rose once more, it was as if the very air shifted. She adjusted her blazer with a deliberate calmness, her gaze sweeping across the chamber until it locked onto Sean Hannity. He sat there trying to project confidence, but the faint twitch in his jaw betrayed unease. The crowd sensed it too. A faint murmur rippled through the benches, echoing the anticipation that something seismic was about to unfold. Jasmine's voice carried with measured authority. "This court has heard enough excuses. We've heard deflection, misdirection, and polished rhetoric. But what we have not heard," she paused, letting her eye cut across Hannity like a blade, "is accountability." Her words hung in the air like smoke from a slow-burning fire. Hannity tried to interject, his tone forced into bravado. "You can throw accusations all day, Congresswoman, but talk is cheap. Where's your evidence? Where's your proof that I—" The interruption was his mistake. Jasmine didn't flinch. Instead, she let silence linger for a moment longer than anyone expected. Then, with a subtle tilt of her chin, she turned toward her aides. From the polished oak table, she lifted a folder thick with documents, bound in leather, sealed with crimson tabs. The audience collectively leaned forward, necks craning, breath held. She laid the folder on the podium, her palm pressed against it as though it were a ledger of justice itself. "You wanted evidence, Mr. Hannity?" she said, her voice low, deliberate, but pulsing with restrained fire. "Here it is." The crowd stirred again, whispers breaking out. Even Judge Caldwell leaned forward, peering with an intensity reserved for the moments when truth threatened to pierce through the fog of political theater. Hannity smirked, but the smirk was brittle. "Papers mean nothing without context. Anyone can print out a few screenshots and call it a scandal." Jasmine didn't even look at him. Instead, she lifted the first sheet from the folder, holding it high for the courtroom to see. Projected onto the large display screens, the document came alive. Emails, direct transcripts, signatures, evidence tying Hannity to back-channel communications that had not only shaped narratives but weaponized them. Gasps shot through the courtroom like sparks on dry tinder. "Emails from your office," Jasmine continued, "directing staffers to suppress stories that contradicted your narrative. Correspondence that reveals coordination. Not journalism, not commentary, but collusion." Hannity's complexion shifted, the flush creeping up his neck. He opened his mouth to respond, but Jasmine was already moving. She stacked the first paper aside and revealed another. "Here, financial transfers to shell organizations, funds funneled through third parties to silence whistleblowers who dared to speak." The gallery erupted in voices, some in disbelief, others in vindication. The judge's gavel struck like thunder, calling for order. Jasmine's eyes burned with righteous conviction. "You asked for receipts, Mr. Hannity. I brought them, every single one. Proof that your empire of influence isn't built on free speech or truth. It's built on manipulation and power games. And today in this chamber that power collapses under its own weight." Hannity slammed his fist against the table, his voice cracking louder than intended. This is a witch hunt. You think waving paper around makes you right? You think people can't see through your political theater? But his words no longer carried strength. They sounded like echoes, hollow against the rising tide of Jasmine's momentum. She leaned forward slightly, her tone dropping, each syllable sharp and deliberate. No, Sean. This isn't theater. This is the reckoning. A hush fell, the kind that doesn't come from silence but from sheer awe. Every eye in the room fixed on her, waiting, trembling with the knowledge that they were witnessing a turning point. Judge Caldwell exhaled heavily, fingers steepled beneath his chin. Even he seemed moved by the weight of the evidence, the undeniable gravity of what had been unveiled. And for the first time, Hannity's defiance faltered. His gaze broke from Jasmine's and darted toward the crowd, as if searching for an ally, a lifeline. But there was none. The audience, even those who once cheered him, sat in stunned quiet, their faith unraveling thread by thread. Jasmine gathered the documents back into the folder, closing it with a single decisive snap. She set it down like the final stroke of a gavel, then spoke with solemn clarity. This, she said, is not about me. It's not about you. It's about every citizen who deserves to live in